Jasmine is an independent filmmaker who directed The Invisible Vegan, a documentary about health in the Black community. Lauren is the founder of the Food Empowerment Project, a food justice nonprofit that promotes veganism, fights for workers, and works on lack of access to healthy foods in minority communities. And Garrett is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. His recent work seeks to examine how new food technologies can advance health and equity in the food system. And before we begin, if you could each tell us more about yourselves and your work, and Jasmine, if you'd like to start, please take the lead.
Okay, cool. And it's how many, what's the time like?
About 5 minutes, but it's okay if you go a little over or a little under, not too strict.
Okay, so I want to just start with my intro into veganism, because when I talk to a lot of vegans, they have these very noble reasons for why they became vegan. I saw a woman in booty shorts in her 60s that I thought looked fantastic. And then I said, hey, I want that body. So that's what led me into veganism, full disclosure. But then as I started eating that way, a lot of my health ailments that I thought were just a part of growing pains started clearing up. So at that point, I'm like, wow, there's so much more to veganism than just trying to get into some booty shorts. So like, I was also working in film production at the time. And so a lot of my friends, while I was on this vegan journey, I was talking to them about it. And at the time, most of my friends were Black, and they just weren't hearing me. They were just like, oh, you moved to LA, you moved to Hollywood. So now you eat like the stars. You can't eat the food you grew up on anymore. And it was this common theme that veganism was a white thing. And to me at the time, it felt so stupid. I'm like, why are they so blind? Why can't they see? It's just eating healthy and it'll help them. So as I, started embarking more on my journey, I started going down the rabbit hole where I'm like reading vegan books and watching different vegan documentaries. And that's when I noticed it. I was just like, wow, after watching all of these documentaries, even though they were great, and I would even credit them for inspiring my work, I'm like, wow, they are all centered around white men. And even the people that they used to speak about the issues, they always, older white men. And I'm like, if you keep marketing to the same group, then other populations are just going to completely miss the message. So that was one thing I noticed. And then another thing that I noticed was when they were talking about veganism, they were ignoring the challenges that people outside of their scope might face. So if you're going to, someone who lives down the street from Whole Foods and has money to shop there every day, it's easy for you to tell her like, hey, why don't you just go vegan? And she can just, pay. She's in a tax bracket where she can afford that kind of food. It's a comfortable change. But if you have someone else who's already stressed out from working, they're in a low income community where they're not even presented with a lot of options to do the diet comfortably, these weren't issues that I saw, the mainstream vegan movement tackling at the time. So that's when I used my film and production background to kind of create a film geared to the people I felt were left out of mainstream conversations.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was fantastic, and I definitely recommend Jasmine's film if you haven't seen it before. It's fantastic, and really appreciate you talking about these issues that I wished were talked about more in the vegan community. And Lauren, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Lauren Ornelas, and I actually started Food Empowerment Project in 2007. I got into animal rights in 1987 and went vegan in 1988, and had, basically done animal rights. I was involved in other social justice issues that I cared about, but I pretty much dedicated myself to doing animal rights work, starting the first animal rights group at a high school in Texas, to running, a national animal rights group and working for other animal rights organizations. But, as time went on, I realized that I was kind of having to leave a part of myself behind. As a very proud Mexican, I knew that was kind of something I always had to leave at the door, that it wasn't really a welcome conversation amongst the very prevalent white vegans in the animal rights movement. I felt like there was no understanding for my culture. I felt like there wasn't a lot of understanding why I would care about farm workers. I grew up with the understanding of the Great Boycott since I was little. I knew about Larry Itliong, the Filipinx farm worker who started it. I grew up knowing about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. and the United Farm Workers, and yet it was something that I was criticized for in the animal rights movement. In 2000, when I learned about what was happening for chocolate with all the slavery and child labor involved, I started talking about that issue as well. And people in the animal rights movement would tell me I was hurting the animals by talking about these other social justice issues. So even though I did investigations of factory farms and slaughterhouses, I got corporate changes in companies such as Pier 1 Imports and Trader Joe's, there was still this part of me that this quote unquote movement wouldn't embrace about me. So in 2007, I decided to start Food Empowerment Project as a way to help connect various issues, because I figured I wasn't the only one who saw the connections between various abuses in the food industry. So I started Food Empowerment Project to represent more of us who could make these connections and issues, who didn't see silos, who didn't say, I only care about animal rights and I don't care about anybody else, and that they're the most oppressed beings on the planet. That I was trying to get people to listen to more about these other human rights abuses that were also in the food industry. So in a nutshell, basically, Food Empowerment Project works in 4 programmatic areas. We work to promote veganism. We do it in a holistic way. We have vegan Mexican food in English and in Spanish, including a booklet to represent my people. My colleagues Filipina, we have vegan Filipinx food for it's in English and Tagalog. We have it in booklet form and on the website. And one of our board members is Lao, so we're coming out with vegan Lao food that will be in English and Lao. And campaigns and efforts for non-human animals as well. I mean, I've been vegan since I was in high school. It's very important to me, and it's a core part of what we do. But by being a vegan and promoting veganism, we are encouraging people to eat more plants. And by doing that, we're also encouraging people to be more dependent on farm workers. And so for an organization and an individual like me, there's no way I can separate promoting veganism. I can't talk about that without talking about the plight of farm workers who pick our food. I mean, unless you grow your own food, you have a farm worker to thank for everything you eat. So it's really important to me and for our organization to talk about the injustices that farm workers endure, as well as things you can do. We've helped change a regulation in California that phenomenally changed the ability for children of farm workers to go to school in California throughout the year. We do a school supply drive for the children of farm workers every year. But we also look at things that like the lack of access to healthy foods in Black and Brown communities, where we have to tell vegans it's not easy. The vegans want to say it's easy to go vegan, but the reality is much different. And those of us who come from less privileged backgrounds know very well that it's not easy to go vegan, like Jasmine had mentioned. So we work, we follow environmental justice principles. We go into communities when people want us to be there, and we go and we do assessments on the availability of healthy foods, including meat and dairy alternatives for, maybe I can talk about that later, but the impact that colonization has had on our diets. And we work with community to try to get healthier food access. We also have a campaign against a corporation called Safeway that has impacted the health of communities. But we also look at, the last area of our work is looking at chocolate. And again, just because something is vegan doesn't mean it's cruelty-free if it comes to the hands of slaves or any other oppression of human animals. So we try to encourage people not to buy chocolate sourced from slavery and child labor. And we have a list on our website of chocolates we do and do not recommend. Every company has to make a vegan chocolate, and we also have this in free apps that people can download. But more than not, we're trying to encourage people to recognize the power of their food choices and also know that their individual choices are important, but just as much are their collective voices to help change and make the world more just and compassionate.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fantastic. I saw you speak in one of my classes at Berkeley almost 10 years ago today, and I remember that was really the first conversation or first talk that really got me interested in understanding veganism from a more intersectional lens. And I really appreciate the work you do and encourage everyone to check out Food Empowerment Project. And with that, I'll hand it over to Garrett next.
Great. Well, thank you so much. First, want to say thank you to the organizers of this event. I've been in most of the sessions throughout the day. It's been great conversations, and I really appreciate the way that this conference in general has been looking at the multitude of intersections between animal issues, human issues, social justice issues, environmental issues, and that kind of integration, which I know is also a focus of this panel, is really what I've tried to make my career sort of grounded in. And so I like to kind of think of myself as an engaged researcher, an engaged scholar. I'm a teacher and a professor and a researcher, but also do a lot of collaborative work with organizations that are doing on the ground, grassroots organizing, policy change to make the food system healthier, more equitable, and more sustainable. And so I've kind of had these two parallel and sometimes intersecting trajectories in my work. On one side, focusing a lot on issues of food access and food justice, and kind of community food issues. On the other side, focusing on issues related to animals in the food system. And it's been interesting. There's some through lines and there's some discontinuities between those two communities. And I, over the years have been frustrated at times that in many of the animal-oriented spaces, the animal rights, animal welfare spaces, considerations of social justice, economic justice, racial justice issues, as Lauren and Jasmine have already noted, have kind of been pushed to the side at times. And that was always really frustrating to me. At the same time, I found in a lot of food justice spaces, community food, spaces that vegetarianism, animal issues in general were often kind of pushed to the side, even though for reasons that Lauren and Jasmine will, have discussed and will discuss, there's a lot of reasons why we can look at a variety of multicultural communities and find real, roots of plant-based dietary practice in those communities. And so a lot of my work has kind of been trying to see how might I bring some of that kind of consideration of social justice, economic and racial justice into the animal rights community, and how might I help communities that are doing work around food access and food justice think about the relationship to animal food production and its implications for things like farm worker communities, for environmental justice issues, for health, and also for these kind of cultural connections. And so one other kind of big through line in my work is I really try to push back against when I see what I think of as kind of magical thinking, magical solutionism, which I see happen a lot in a variety of food system conversations. In a lot of kind of like community food and garden-based education work, I see a lot of what I've referred to over the years and write about in a book that I wrote. I call it the magic carrot approach to food justice. This idea that if children, particularly low-income children, Black and brown children, if they only knew where that carrot came from, if they could only see that carrot seed planted and grow, then sort of they'd magically be happy and healthy, and all these other issues would disappear. And it's like, no, that's not how it works, right? And so a lot of my work on food justice issues has been focusing on groups that realize it's not a magical process of just getting kids in the dirt, as useful as that might be, right? But how does it connect to a broader strategy of community change, of social change, and of policy change? And then I'm also seeing a lot of magical thinking that I'm skeptical of at times in the animal rights community, in the emerging plant-based, food tech community, this idea that, if we just find that perfect formulation for the vegan burger, then everybody's going to be vegan and it's going to solve all of our environmental problems and so on and so forth. But I'm kind of straw manning here the argument a little bit, but there's no single silver bullet solution to any of these issues. They're multi-layered, they're complex, and that's what I try to really dig into. And one of the things that I really enjoy about being kind of in this scholarly side is that I'm able to work with that nuance and try to develop, critically, conceptually, but then also at a practical level, how do we actually figure out how to work through these really complex challenges and create solutions that live up to that complexity and aren't these kind of magical carrots or magical vegan burgers or what have you. So that's the approach that I bring to this work.
Thank you so much, Garrett. That was fantastic. Nina Gaiman, who's here with us today, introduced me to your work and your research, and I look forward to hearing more about all the work you've done, especially with the social issues that we see in food tech. As someone living in San Francisco in the Bay Area, we're in the middle of the food tech hub, and I definitely look forward to hearing more about your perspective on a lot of the issues we see in that space. So Thank you for that introduction. And with that, I'll go into some of the questions for our panel today. And Jasmine, I'd love to start with you. And I know you already alluded to this in your introduction, but I'd love to hear you expand a little bit more on what you think the cultural image is of a typical vegan and how does it fail to reflect reality? Oh, I think you're on mute.
It's so funny because I just posted on my Instagram, I was wearing a t-shirt and Chef AJ made it for me and it said, veganism is not just for skinny white women anymore. And and there was a lot of sensitivity on the comment thread where people called me a racist and I'm microaggressive. It was just all this stuff. But when I think about how I used to see veganism presented, that was the presentation. And not only in the vegan space, when you're talking about like the health space, when you see the person doing yoga, when you see, you know, the girl holding the green smoothie, it's not a size 16 Black girl with cornrows. It was never that. Like I never saw that. It was always usually the white girl, size 5 or smaller with a ponytail, usually blonde. And that's how it looked. And the problem with that is if people don't see themselves represented and they continuously see something associated with a certain body type, race, gender, etc., they're not going to be as interested because they're going to think, oh, you know what, that's not my space. That's not for me because I'm never included in that space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for sharing that perspective. And Lauren, if you'd like to answer that question too, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Part of the problem is exactly what Jasmine's saying, but I feel like it's a problem of the animal rights and vegan movement. And that's because they do not highlight the voices of Black and brown vegans. That's not who they want people to see. It's not who they want people to think of, because primarily a lot of them don't even employ a lot of Black and brown people. And that in and of itself comes to a pay equity issue that many Black and brown people are giving money to our parents. We are paying off loans. We're paying off student loans. We don't have the flexibility to work at a job that pays us nothing. So you have pretty much very privileged people who are able to work in the animal rights movement. So what you see are people who look like them. And it's not going to be people really who look like Jasmine and I. And so it's a responsibility as well as acknowledging these filmmakers, again, not Jasmine, but these very white filmmakers and who it is that they turn to, you know, who they see as experts. You know, I mean, it's bizarre who a lot of these people think are experts. And sometimes the only thing that makes them an expert is that they're a white man. So.
And Garrett, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, and particularly if your research has looked into this issue at all. And I'm thinking in terms of food tech and maybe who these companies are employing or what customers they're serving and what issues you see with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, so I'm in the discipline of communication and media studies. So I'm really always interested in kind of two main areas. One is, what are the stories we're telling? What are the kind of dominant narratives? And two, what are the networks what are the networks of individuals and organizations that are involved? Actually, one of the first projects I did as a graduate student was looking at media coverage of vegetarian and veganism from a kind of multicultural perspective, and did a kind of media content analysis. This is now 10, 12, 15 years ago. But just how it was just interesting to see back then. It's changed a little bit, but anytime sort of vegetarianism was associated with a Black community or a Latino community, it was like this big shocker. The headline was always like, Black vegan ? Like, you'll never believe it, right? And I just think it goes to show sort of who's telling that story, and the kind of shallow level of investigation that's being done. I've heard this. I've been plugged into this conference throughout the day, going back to the early morning, where discussion of the cultural roots of vegetarianism, the global international roots of plant-based foods, and so I definitely think what we're seeing in a lot of the marketing for a lot of these newer products, which I'm not necessarily opposed to these new products. I want to kind of put that out there. I'm glad they exist, but also there is a kind of, they're selling the novelty of it, right? As opposed and saying it's this kind of new idea that's completely new, we're doing something that has never been done before. And I think there is definitely a process of erasure that happens in doing so, right? As we fail to recognize the varieties of culinary innovations that have been happening throughout. I mean, look, anybody who's been vegan long enough and has traveled places knows, some of the best vegan food you're going to find is in the Ethiopian restaurant or in the Mexican restaurant or in the, you name it, right? The Asian restaurants where vegetarian food, plant-based food, alternative meats, whether they're being called that directly or not, have been, created for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. So yeah, so the narratives I think are shifting a little bit. I think things like social media, I think, what we're seeing from folks like Jasmine, the ability to have new filmmakers and new kind of forms of distribution on streaming platforms, stuff like that. We're seeing a lot more opportunities for those stories to change. And I think we're seeing some efforts, in terms of the organizations that are involved in advocating around these issues to start to think about some of these issues and to start to diversify staff and outreach, but still early stages and still a lot of room for improvement.
Thank you so much, Garrett, for sharing that perspective. And I know we definitely have a ways to go with that. And building off that question a little bit, and Jasmine, I'll take this back to you. What are your recommendations for addressing the image bias in the plant-based food movement? So, I think you're on mute. Here we go.
So one thing I think we really need to do, not even just the obvious. For me, the obvious is if you have a panel and all your panel is white, but you want a diverse audience, it's like, come on, add some color, add people of different body types. And another thing is add people who maybe don't have the traditional expertise. Like, I go to a lot of these conferences and no shade, Garrett, when I say this, but like they throw out a lot of academic people. And it's great, it's great to have people that know how to break the issue down in certain ways. But it's like, if that's not the majority of your audience, then it's, again, you're missing a huge portion of the population. Like when I did my film, I want to make sure that even if you're in 6th grade, you can understand it. So people on multiple, educational levels can understand your film. So I think that's one thing we can do to kind of change the image. And then another thing is when you're a white person and you're spreading the message of veganism, even though you go through life thinking like, I don't even believe in race, I don't even see it, understand that other people do. And understand that you might be fitting into certain dynamics that you don't mean to fit in. So when you go to someone of another race and you start, kind of demanding that they eat a certain way, and you kind of come at them with intensity that doesn't feel like it's coming from a positive place, you might just think, oh, I'm just innocently advocating for veganism. We think like, as a Black person, I always have to change to fit into what white people want. I have to straighten my hair. I can't wear African print. I have to wear things they like. So again, it comes down to, dang, I have to fit in your box. I have to eat your food in order for me to fit in. And sometimes people don't realize they fit in that dynamic. So just knowing how the cultural nuances of the people that you approach, and just knowing what you bring. Like even me, I'm right now I'm about a size 6. So I know when I'm talking to people who are not size 6s, it can come off different. It can translate different. So I need to make sure that I'm very careful in my wording. And I think everyone needs to have, you need to make sure you have that education on how to advocate before you go and try to advocate to people that you don't relate to.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I think you're amazing and completely agree with everything you said, and really appreciate you sharing your perspective. And Lauren, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the same question as well. I would also love to hear more about your organization's work, but maybe if you don't mind addressing what recommendations you have for addressing the image bias in the plant-based food movement.
Sure, I definitely echo what Jasmine says. I also think that, I kind of have this reaction to this concept, and I just wrote a blog about this, about why I don't use the word intersectional to talk about Food Empowerment Project's work, partially because it is an academic term, and I created the organization as it is, and I'm not an academic, I'm literally just an activist. But I have this thing about like trying to feel like we need to start collecting more Black and brown people. Look, if we were more welcoming to Black and brown people, there'd be more of us here. The fact is that this movement uses racism to promote animal rights and has no qualms. They defend the use of certain terms. You know, to like, again, like I was saying before about just because it's vegan doesn't mean it's cruelty-free. You can't tell a group of people that something's cruelty-free when they work on farm worker justice issues, or their parents were farm workers, or if they know about slavery in the chocolate industry, or they know I mean, we need to be more careful about these things, these sound bites that we want to say that literally are not true. And anybody who's involved in any other social justice movement, they know it's not true. And if we try to tell people it's easy to go vegan in a room full of people, and one of those people says, you know what, my aunt wanted to go vegan, it was really hard for her because she gets all of her groceries at the liquor store. So they know that discredits everything we've just said. So we need to be smarter about what we say. We also need to think about how much we charge for conferences and events. Is it accessible to everybody? Where's the location? Is there public transportation? Where is this at? Is everybody going to feel safe when they attend? Because if it's in a really right area, they may not feel safe at all. You know, we're worried about walking around college campuses where we're going to be looked at like, what are you trying to steal? So you also have the fact of funding. We need more funding, you know, for Black and brown led organizations. We need funding. Jasmine needs funding to get her work out there. You know, regardless if she does a film about veganism or not, she is a Black vegan filmmaker. Her work deserves to be funded because she's still a Black vegan getting the word out there just by doing interviews, just by, you know, if she does another documentary that has nothing to do with veganism, they're still going to talk about her first documentary. People are still going to check it out. She needs funding to do her work. Food Empowerment Project, other Black and brown led vegan organizations, we do not get the funding that other groups do. And we're reaching completely different audiences, because we're now in spaces that vegans and animal rights activists were not allowed in before, because we're talking about connections of issues, and we're willing to talk about other things. We're willing to talk about farm workers. We're willing to talk about racism that the animal rights movement hasn't really been wanting to talk about. So anyway, that's my ramble in answer to that question.
Thank you so much for sharing, Lauren. Yeah, I've been pretty shocked at a lot of the white supremacy that I've seen in the vegan movement lately. They're very vocal on social media. They're very loud. And I think it's a huge issue that we don't discuss enough in the plant-based food movement. So I appreciate you talking about this and bringing this issue up in this conversation. And Garrett, I'd also love to know from your research and everything you've done, what methods do you believe are most effective or ineffective in reducing these food system inequalities that we've been discussing?
Yeah, there's a couple kind of big picture principles that I think are useful to think about if we're trying to change, you know, some of the food system inequalities. So one is, I think, a central point that's already been made, which is it needs to be a culture-centered approach, right? And culture-centered is not only about race and ethnicity, although that's a big part of it. But it also means, it really means understanding, you know, if there's an intervention that's going on, right? And I hesitate to use some of this kind of very public health terminology, although I know we have a lot of public health folks on this conference, right? But if there's a kind of quote unquote target of the intervention, we really need to understand everything from the perspective of that individual and that community, right? And so their racial, ethnic background, their food culture is going to matter there. Gender is a huge component of any time we think about food system inequalities. Gender, motherhood in particular, a central way to think about the challenges of food insecurity and food inequality are often particularly on the shoulders of women, on mothers. And so the kind of class, gender, race, you know, components here, as well as, you know, geography, region, all these sorts of things. So culture-centered approach is number one. Any intervention, anytime you're trying to, you know, make someone else's life better, you need to kind of stop and say, actually, that's not the right frame, right? I need to understand this person's life, and I need to hear from them what do they think is better, right? What's better for them? So that's number one, is that kind of culture-centered approach. Number two is thinking in terms of environmental change. So not just focusing on how do I change the ideology, the perspective, the individual decision-making of this one person, but how do I create a food environment, a community environment that is more health promoting? And that's been a huge, issue throughout, American society, global society, when we think about kind of unhealthy food environments, and making some of those changes to the lived and physical environment can go a long way towards impacting larger numbers of people within communities. So culture-centered, environmental, and the third one is policy-oriented. So how do we, again, it's just pushing us away from just that individualized focus to think about how can we change the kind of broader policy, social environment in which people live. And one of the best things, I'm often, in the work that I've done for years, often asked, like, if I could change one food policy to promote healthier eating, to promote better food access, what would it be? And my answer is usually, affordable housing, or a guaranteed living wage, or universal basic income, right? Like, some of the best food policies are not directly about food at all. They're really about addressing the material and economic conditions of American life and global society, and tackling those fundamental inequalities and the kind of legacies of discrimination that have led to the development of those inequalities. So think big. Don't just think about food. Think from the perspective of those who you're trying to support, and think about how do we change environments and not just individual behavior.
That was fantastic, Garrett. Thank you so much. So culture-centered, environmental, and policy, just to recap that. I'm taking notes as well. And yeah, that was fantastic. And just to switch the direction of the conversation a little bit, Lauren, we've been getting some questions from the audience about this as well. I'd love for you to elaborate on the impact of colonization on diets that you brought up earlier. We'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, I think there's this misconception that, again, vegans and animal rights activists like to say, where they act as if every indigenous person was a vegan, like, oh, let's decolonize your diet. And you're like, I don't want to decolonize my diet. I mean, I don't want to be eating insects and eggs and turkeys again. I mean, it's kind of, again, this like weird thing that we just can't be honest about stuff, that we have to exaggerate everything. We have to be racist. We have to exaggerate everything. We have to just to get people to go vegan, and not realizing that just our compassion might be effective in and of itself. But basically, I'm indigenous to the Americas, and so my ancestors were not vegans because they ate eggs and turkeys and insects, but they ate far less animals. Basically, Columbus brought the cows over on the fourth voyage to the Americas, and that is when milk, animal-based milk was introduced to my people. We didn't eat a lot of, we ate a lot of food that came from the earth. The Europeans didn't want to become savages like us, so they were slowly bringing their foods over, which intermingled with ours. But at the end of the day, when we talk about colonization and food, I think the important thing is to recognize the legacy that colonization has had on us that still exists today. And that is the fact that many of us are what's termed lactose intolerant, but Food Empowerment Project instead calls it lactose normal. Meaning, one, what is that about consuming milk of another species? And two, why is the onus always put on Black and brown and indigenous people that we can't digest animal-based milk? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's actually a deviant gene in white Europeans. There's nothing wrong with us for not being able to digest a colonized food. So this legacy of colonization still impacts us today. The communities that we work in on lack of access to healthy foods, it's not plant-based milk that you find in the liquor stores and convenience stores. That's one of the things that we survey for. So basically, what does that mean? That means that our kids, our families are getting sick, because that's pretty much where they're getting their food from. So they're getting sick, they go to school with stomach aches, they go to work, they're not feeling good, or they feel different if they don't want to consume cow-based ice cream. So there's a lot of things in this colonization, and obviously every indigenous peoples is different. And again, I think it's important to remember that, the people who were enslaved from Africa and the United States, that's a whole different thing. It's not necessarily the same type of colonization. They weren't colonized here, they were enslaved here. So when we talk about colonization in the Americas, it's the indigenous people, but we know that colonization took place in the continent of Africa. We know it took place in India. We know it's taking place predominantly where Black and brown people are. And so our food is really, our food is from all over, right? And so I worry when vegans act as if they want us to decolonize our diet for the sheer fact that many of us would not be vegan. And just to say that a lot of us come from more plant-based ancestors.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I don't know if you watched Dr. Milton Mills earlier talk about this issue with dairy and the dietary guidelines, but a lot of overlap with what you were saying, and really appreciate you sharing that. And I have so many more questions, but I know the audience has a lot of great questions that have been coming in, so I might transition into the audience questions to get some of them out there. So let's see, Jasmine, I might direct the next one to you. How do we elevate the importance of human labor rights and its intertwined relationship with animal rights? In other words, the emotional and physical toll of often low-income and minority people working in animal slaughterhouses.
You know what? I am actually going to throw that at Lauren, not to put her on the spot, but I feel like she's a better person to answer that question.
Great. Yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah, if you want to answer.
And this is
Lauren.
about slaughterhouse workers?
Yeah, I think they specifically referred to people working in animal slaughterhouses.
Well, one of my things about this is asking any vegan how they would feel if those farm workers then got paid well, had full benefits. Would they be okay with that? Would they say, oh, I'm talking about how the animals are treated and how the workers are treated in slaughterhouses. What if those slaughterhouse workers they got great pay and they got health benefits? I think they'd still have a problem with that slaughterhouse, right? I sure as hell would. So why is it that we only bring up slaughterhouse workers? This is my concern when we talk about slaughterhouse workers, is that we're not bringing up slaughterhouse workers because we actually care about slaughterhouse workers. We bring up slaughterhouse workers because somehow we want to get people to stop consuming animals. And I find it to be incredibly transparent. So I would say that there's a lot of problems, obviously, with slaughterhouses, but I think it's just important that we start to look at where our food comes from and how those workers are treated. Because just because you're not consuming animals, you're not supporting a slaughterhouse, but if you're still consuming fruits and vegetables, then you need to care about where your food's coming from. You can't have it both ways. You can't try to get people who eat animals to care about slaughterhouse workers if you're not going to care about the people who are picking your food. So it's one of the reasons why Food Empowerment Project doesn't work on slaughterhouse issues. Do we talk about it? Absolutely. What's happening to slaughterhouse workers is horrific. I wrote a blog asking vegans to have more sympathy for slaughterhouse workers who got COVID. And what we got in return was racist, horrific responses from vegans. How dare we care? These people deserve to die. These people were chasing our followers from our Facebook page to their own Facebook pages just because they expressed it was okay to have sympathy for slaughterhouse workers. So at the end of the day, I worry this is one of those tropes that vegans use to try and get people to care about non-human animals without consistency, right? If you care about slaughterhouse workers, absolutely, I think you should. But please don't act like that the farm workers who pick your food don't matter.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. And I was just reading a comment from the chat from your response earlier as well. And the student mentioned that this changed their perspective on decolonizing diets, and I would agree with that as well. And just to be mindful of time, I know we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes. Jasmine, I know a lot of students are very interested in your movie, and someone had asked if you have a favorite moment from your movie or something you'd want to share about it with the audience.
And it better be when I was in it. So.
Yeah, no. That's on point. No, my favorite part of the movie is, I think if you really do your job when you're doing a documentary, you discover something new yourself because you're investigating. So you should be learning something as well. And when I went into the project, I actually wasn't that big on the animal rights portion. It was just like, it's messed up what's happening to the animals, but my, compassionate connection, full disclosure, it just was not there yet. And then after talking to everybody and kind of hearing it from a perspective that I could relate to, that's what kind of created the shift for me. So that was my favorite part of the documentary, the growth I got behind the scenes.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jasmine. And Garrett, I'll direct the next question to you. Your work urges caution around food tech companies not taking into account issues of access. How can such issues be addressed?
Yeah, so I've been kind of working through this concept that I've been referring to as food tech justice, right? So we talk a lot about food justice and we talk about food tech. Where is that intersection? I don't think it's just on the companies necessarily. I think in a capitalist society, these companies are going to do what capitalist companies do, and they're going to bring products to market, and they might have some useful environmental impacts. They might have, be good for animals, right? Like I said, I'm not opposed to these companies necessarily. However, they're not going to solve everything. And in fact, they might actually create new problems, exacerbate existing problems. And so I think it's really on us more so. Those of us who are in this conversation, who care about issues of food equity, food access, food justice, who care about issues of animal welfare, animal rights, to figure out where is that relationship. I think it's really, for me, a lot of it is, okay, what can we look at in the food chain, right? And where might we hold these new technologies to account in terms of what they're actually doing in terms of contributing to economic well-being, to labor rights, as well as are they producing products that are good for people, right? There's this analogy that gets used a lot by some of the kind of biggest boosters of some of these new food techs, in the animal world, where they talk about how there was this big problem of horse poop in New York. I don't know if you've heard this story told, right? This big problem of horse poop in New York in the 19th century. There was horse poop everywhere, and they were trying to figure out this big issue. How do we solve this issue? And then the issue was basically solved not by anything related to dealing with the horse poop, but by creating cars, right? And then the horse poop issue was gone, right? And this is put forth as sort of this example of, hey, technology is going to save the day. And I can't help but think about how much that story misses, right? Like, okay, sure, is the world better because we have cars? In some ways, but also like, how many people die every year from vehicular-related accidents, right? How about the development of highways and the way that highways, cut right through, I'm in New York City, right through Puerto Rican neighborhoods on the Upper West Side, the giant highways and the air pollution they've caused and the issues of asthma, et cetera, right? So I just think that is one example of, all right, if you only tell the beginning of that story, it sounds like this technology solved all these problems. But if you keep digging in, you see it actually might have created a whole new set of problems. And again, that's not to say we shouldn't have cars in this world or we shouldn't have, Beyond and Impossible burgers, but let's take a step back, let's take a deep breath, and let's really analyze what are the implications here, and then figure out how do we intervene in a productive way. And that's maybe my last, point that I'll make here. I totally hear you, Jasmine, that these panels and things like this should not just be filled with academics like myself, right? And I think that it's important because I know this audience has a lot of folks who are in, undergraduate and graduate school, to kind of figure out where you can intervene in a productive way. And so that's kind of the challenge I would throw out to you, and something I grapple with all the time in my work, right? It doesn't mean you should shut up and go away because you haven't necessarily come from a community that experiences, food injustice, right? But it does mean there are moments where you should step back and listen. And then there are moments where you should figure out where can you leverage your skills, your capacities, your privileges, you name it, and how do you intervene in that kind of productive way? And so that's what I'm trying to do in this work, and I think that's what we all should, try to strive for. What are those right moments where you have a leverage point to advocate for the issues that you think matter?
Thank you so much, Garrett. That was fantastic, and you actually answered the last question that I was going to ask from all of you, and that was, what would you recommend for an audience? And I think it's safe to say that most of us come from academia or in academia right now that wants to learn more about this issue. And maybe since you've answered that, we can have Jasmine and Lauren answer that to wrap things up. Lauren, would you like to start?
I mean, I think that there's a lot that you can do. I think one is listening to the communities. We do work with a lot of people who have public health degrees because we desperately need you and want you. But our work is not geared where you would be the one talking. You'd be the one analyzing the data that comes from the community. We don't think that everybody belongs in the community, honestly. But we do know that we need your skills to help. In every aspect of what's happening, going back to the topic of obstacles to accessing healthy food, it's throughout the entire supply chain, and it ends up, it's from the time the food is planted to the truck drivers, to the grocery store workers, to the fast food workers, to the communities that lack access to healthy foods. There are a lot of roadblocks that happen. I do think that getting off a capitalist system, sorry everybody, is actually what's best. And I think looking for community by community, one of the things that we see as a solution to the lack of access to healthy foods, living wages. Everybody here can fight for living wages. Every single person can fight for that. The corporations, to your city, to your state legislation, you can fight for it. But we also believe in worker-owned cooperatives, right? Where the workers have the power. We believe in unions. We believe when the people who have the least power get that power, because they're going to look out for community. And so I think that it's really figuring out ways to break down these barriers that exist, holding corporations accountable for the damage that they're doing to our communities, and to look at the community growing up, meaning that you look how you can be part of the community, and if you aren't from that community, how you can help that community. And if you're a white person and you have a lot of money, at the end of the day, it best might be supporting those groups in the community that have those urban gardens, who are teaching people to go back to growing their own food, or the churches in the community are making sure that they fight for living wages and access to healthy foods.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And we'll wrap it up with Jasmine. We'd love to hear your perspective too.
So I would say, whatever your situation is, learn to think outside of it. Learn to think about obstacles you might not have considered. Like I saw one of the comments on the post, and I'm not kind of calling you out because I used to kind of think the same way. And it said, berries, beans, it's that simple. And the thing is, it might be that simple for you, but for me, and even for me, it would be that simple. But I put myself in my sister's place, right? My sister, she has 5 children. She has a husband. So while it might seem simple to just switch and eat beans all day, how do you get 5 kids hooked on that diet? It's not that simple. And even when you say berries, I don't know if you looked at the price tag to most berries. If you want to get the good fruit, that's expensive. That's something that you need to be in the middle class even to afford a carton of strawberries and blueberries. So you might be saying hey, go get berries. What you're telling them is, oh, well, just go get apples every day because that's the fruit that's in their price range. And to ask someone to eat a diet that limited, it's not an easy thing. So just always think beyond yourself. I talked to a woman who said when she was young, she used to get, not to take it here, she used to get molested. So to comfort herself, to get ready for that molestation, she would go in her refrigerator and she would gorge on everything so she could fill herself up just to tolerate what was about to happen to her. There are so many psychological relationships that people have with food that we don't even consider. So when you think it's simple to tell someone to change something that personal, just remember, just because it's simple to you, it might not be that simple to other people. And really think about those things when you take this message into the world, because you don't want to trigger people. You want to help them, and you want them to know that you understand where they're coming from so they can trust you enough to follow your advice.
Wow, thank you so much, Jasmine, and all of you, Garrett, Lauren, and You all did amazing today. That was phenomenal. And I know students are definitely looking forward to talking to you more in our networking session later. So thank you again for coming here. It was such a great conversation and appreciate you discussing these issues with us. And for everyone else in the audience, we're going to go on a short 10-minute break before the next session. And Jasmine, Lauren, and Garrett will see you later
Perfect.
today.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.